All right, everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Mr. Digital 45, and we're about to do the M's. Sorry, I keep not making videos for a long time. Very busy. And we're going to start off with My Father the Hero. Next up, we got Meet the Fuckers. Next up, we got a movie called Monster House. Followed by Clint Eastwood in Magnum Force. Next up, we got Nicole Kidman and Alec Baldwin in Malice. Next up, we got Charlton Heston in Major Dundee. Next up, we got Nicole Kidman and Ewan McGregor in Moulin Rouge. Next up, we got Michael Keaton in Multiplicity. We got all these to go through. That's why I said this is going to be a little bit of a video. Next up, we got Monty Python and the Meaning of Life. Next up, we got a movie called Mimic. Next up, we got James Stewart, John Wayne, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, also with Lee Marvin. Next up, we got Sally Field and James Garner in Murphy's Romance. So I was glad I didn't buy that the other day. Next up, we got Tom Selleck in Mr. Baseball. Next up, we got Matt Dillon in Mr. Wonderful. Next up, we got The Man from U.N.C.L.E. movie with Henry Cavill. Next up, we got Match Point with Scarlett Johansson. I think that's Scarlett Johansson. Next up, we got Nicolas Cage and Sam Rockwell in The Matchstick Men. Oh, I guess I got another copy of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Okay, now I can get rid of that one. Didn't know I had a double. Okay, next up we got James Stewart and Maureen O'Hara and Mr. Hobb Takes a Vacation. Next up we got a movie called Madness and the Method. Next up, we got some Jackie Chan and Mr. Nice Guy. Next up, we got the movie Midnight Express. Next up, we got the movie The Musketeer. All right, next up, we got Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady. Next up, we got Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Next up, we got Burt Reynolds and The Man Who Loved Women. Also with Julie Andrews and Kim Basinger. One of her first starring roles. Next up, we got Judy Garland in Meet Me in St. Louis. Next up, we got an animated classic, The Man Called Flintstone, when they had their own movie come out back then. Next up, we got My Best Friend is a Vampire, part of the Vestron collection. Next up, we got McHale's Navy. Next up, we got The Muppets Christmas Carol. Next up, we got Gary Oldman and Mary. Next up, we got Leonardo DiCaprio and The Man in the Iron Mask. Next up, we got some Katie Holmes and Miss Meadows. Alright. Next up, we got a movie called A Murder of the Crows with Cuba Gooding Jr. and Tom Berenger. A Murder of Crows. Okay. Next up, we got Disney classic Mulan. Next up, we got The Muppets Take Manhattan. Next up, we got Maximum Risk with Jean-Claude Van Damme. Next up, we got a movie called Monstrous. Next up, we got some more Jackie Chan, and this one's called The Medallion. Next up, we got late Bill Paxton and Charlize Theron and Mighty Joe Young. Damon Wayans and Major Payne. Next up in these M's, we got a movie called Monster Party. Next up, we got some Omar Sharif and the great Gregory Peck in McKenna's Gold. Next up, we got the holiday classic, Miracle on 34th Street. Yeah, Christmas is just around the corner. All right, here we go. Yeah, we got all these still to go. Okay, next up, we got Tom Cruise and Minority Report. Oh, looks like we're coming across another double. Disney's Mulan again. I'll show you it because it's a double, and let's put that in the doubles pile. Next up, we got a movie called The Mangler 2. I do not believe I have the first one. I think I will have to find it. Next up, we got a movie called The Macintosh Man. That's with Paul Newman. Next up, we got the movie MASH. And you know, after this movie came out, they made the TV series, the classic TV series MASH. But it wouldn't be a TV series if it wasn't for this movie first. Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould. Who's in that? Next up, we got Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith and Men in Black. Next up, we got the same two gentlemen in Men in Black 2. And this time, we got Men in Black 3, joined by Josh Brolin in this one. Then we kind of got the movie with Chris Hemsworth, Men in Black International. Kind of a sequel, but not a sequel, I guess. I don't know. And followed by another copy of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So there's another double. I like that copy better. Keep coming back. Alright. Next up, we got the Mummy Collection, which includes the original Mummy, the Mummy's Hand, the Mummy's Tomb, the Mummy's Ghost, and the Mummy's Curse. And Abbott Costello Meet the Mummy are all in this collection of the Mummy Collection. Next up, we got the Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, or whatever, The Mummy. Next up, we got The Mummy Returns. Next up in my collection, I got Major League, Charlie Sheen, Tom Berenger. Next up, we got Major League 2. And then after that, we got Major League back to the minors. Next up, we got Mortuary by MVD Video. Young Bill Paxton in this movie. One of his first movie roles. Next up, we got Roger Moore and Moonraker. Right, continuing this marathon of M's, we got Movie 43. James Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Followed by The Man with the Golden Gun, Roger Moore. James Bond, of course. Then we got some Tom Hanks and Shelley Long in The Money Pit. Okay, I'm sorry, I was getting the next thing in order. Next up, we got My Bloody Valentine 3D, the remake of the 81 classic. I think it's 81. Next up, we got some Chuck Norris and Missing in Action. Next up, we got John Saxon and Moonshine County Express. Next up, we got some Mad Heidi. Followed by Mark Wahlberg and Mile 22. And speaking of that My Bloody Valentine 1981 movie, here it is, the Scream Factory version. Then we got the ultimate cover. Yeah. Next up, we got Sean Connery and Tippi Hedren and Alfred Hitchcock's Marnie. Next up, we got some Monsters Incorporated, Disney classic. Well, it'll eventually become it's a contemporary classic, I should say, a newer classic of Disney's. John Goodman and Billy Crystal do the voices. Next up, we got the sequel, Monsters University, which is actually a prequel to Monsters Incorporated. Next up, we got, Mel Gibson, Mad Max. Alright, next up we got Scream Factory Steelbook, Motel Hell. Very great horror classic from the 80s. Next up we got the Clint Eastwood directed movie, Mystic River, with Sean Penn, Tim Robbins. Next up, we got the music and lyrics, Drew Barrymore and Hugh Grant. Next up, we got My Boss's Daughter. Oh, followed by Cher and Sam Elliott in Mask, and Eric Stoltz playing Rocky Dennis in this movie. Next up, we got Monsters vs. Aliens, Eating Pumpkins from Outer Space. Alright, next up we got Matrix Reloaded. Matrix Revolutions. It seems I don't have the original Matrix unless I have it out of order somewhere. I don't know. Next up we got The Mighty Ducks 2. And The Mighty Ducks 3. And I don't think I have the first one. Just like The Matrix, I don't have the first one for some reason. Okay, next up we got Megan. Then we got some Sandra Bullock and Miss Congeniality. Then next up we got Stick Together. Gerard Butler and Machine Gun Preacher. Then we got some Wesley Snipes and Diane Lane and Murder at 1600. Next up we got some Shirley Jones and Robert Preston and The Music Man. Next up we got some Sandra Bullock and Murder by Numbers. Next up we got, oh, my leg is falling asleep, The Mutant Chronicles. Okay, next up we got, I hate when they stick together, Marlon Brando and Yul Brynner and Morituri. I don't know how you'd announce that. Next up we got some Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Harvey and Janet Leigh, and The Manchurian Candidate. Next up we got Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger and Marrying Man. Next up we got some Joe Pesci, Ralph Macchio, Marissa Tomei, and Fred Gwynne, and My Cousin Vinny. Next up we got Minions. Next up we got Man of Conquest. Followed by a movie called The Music Box. Next up we got some Kate Hudson and My Best Friend's Girl. Next up we got Robert De Niro, Bill Murray, and Uma Thurman in Mad Dog and Glory. Next up, we got The Mask of Zorro. Next up, we got Andrew McCarthy and Kim Cattrall in Mannequin. Next up, we got some Robert De Niro again, Men of Honor. Next up, we got Julia Roberts in My Best Friend's Wedding. Followed by the movie Mouse Hunt. Next up, we got Minions, The Rise of Gru. Followed by Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, and Montgomery Clift in The Misfits. Next up, we got some Billy Bob Thornton and Halle Berry in Monsters Ball. Next up, we got Masterminds. Next up, we got My Dog Skip. Next up, we got A Million Ways to Die in the West. Followed by the movie Mirror, Mirror, Julia Roberts. Take on Snow White. Next up, we got Adam Sandler and Mr. Deeds. Van Winona Ryder. Alright, next up we got Matilda. A movie called Modern Romance with Albert Brooks and Catherine Harold. Next up, we got Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson in The Missouri Breaks. Next up, we got a movie called Murder Party, a different one. That's a weird one. Next up, we got Henry Cavill and Man of Steel. Next up, we got Madagascar. Ben Stiller and Chris Rock. Next up, we got the sequel, Madagascar Escape to Africa. Next up, we got Madagascar 3, Europe's Most Wanted. By the way, it was Madagascar Escape Africa, I believe. Is that part 2 of that one? Okay, next up we got Man in a Vault. Next up we got The Man from Snowy River. Next up, we got some Mark Wahlberg and Max Payne. Whew. Oh, I dropped it. Next up, we got a movie called Maximum Impact. Next up, we got a movie called Maps to the Stars. And next one, we got a real creepy movie where I thought was a creepy movie when I was a kid, but it's tame by now, but it's still a great, great movie. Anthony Hopkins and Margaret and Burgess Meredith and Magic. Next up, we got a movie called Motherlode with Charlton Heston. Next up, we got Brad Pitt and Angela Lee, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Next up, we got Mystery Men, Ben Stiller and an all-star cast. Next up, we got an all-star cast. Includes Johnny Depp, Murder on the Orient Express, the remake movie, because they already had a movie. Next up, we got Disney's Meet the Robinsons. Next up, we got some Richard Gere and Mr. Jones. Followed by the original, The Muppet Movie. Their first movie, outing movie. All-star cast in that one. Next up, we got Monsters vs. Aliens. Next up, we got Megamind. Next up, we got Meet the Parents. Next up, we got John Wayne and McClintock. Fraser and Chris Kattan and Bridget Fonda and Monkey Bone. Next up, we got some Jack Lemmon, James Garner, and Dan Aykroyd and My Fellow Americans. Next up, we got Dustin Hoffman and Marathon Man. We're getting close. Next up, we got some Wesley Snipes and The Marksman. Next up, we got some Sean Penn. Quit sticking. Milk. Next up, we got Michael Keaton and Nicole Kidman in My Life. Next up, we got Heather Graham and my thumb, My Dead Boyfriend. Next up, we got Tom Cruise and Mission Impossible. Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible 2. Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible 3. Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. That's all the Mission Impossible movies I have. And to wrap up the M's in this video, we got George Clooney, Jeff Bridges, Ewan McGregor, Kevin Spacey, and GOAT. And the men who stare at goats. Thank you for watching this video and clicking it on. Don't forget to give a thumbs up. I'm Mr. Digital 45. Until next time, see ya.